Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me here today. My name is Margaret McDonald. I'm a pro-aging advocate, and I'm here to talk about ageism, what it is, what it does to us, and most importantly, what we can do to help stop it and its negative effects. Now, I like to start out by asking a question. When's the last time you heard something positive about aging? Think about the last time. Now, maybe you've heard about the U-curve of happiness, which I'm showing on this slide. This is a graph that's kind of shaped like a smile, and it shows that when people rate their life satisfaction, it starts out relatively high in childhood, and then it goes downhill until about the late 40s, and then it goes back up again, with the oldest adults being the very happiest. Now, the graph goes up to the 80s and 90s, and that's the highest part of the smile. Or maybe you've heard about some older celebrities recently speaking out positively about their age. Or you've seen this article from the Wall Street Journal, "Gray hair is the new power move for women at work." There's a photo here of a definitely grown-up woman with lovely gray hair. She's looking down to the right and kind of resting her head in the back of her hand. And to me, it looks like she's taking some notes while she's listening to somebody talk. The subtitle says, "More women are letting their hair go gray. They don't care what you think about it." Now, these positive aging articles are pretty rare, but lately they seem to be on the upswing. And of course, there's something that I notice. Maybe you've seen the new trend toward age-friendly birthday cards, like this one on the left that says, "You're not old. The jokes about getting old are getting old." Or the one on the right, this one has a watercolor painting of two fortune cookies on a blue background. And on the inside of the card, it says, "How lucky are we to celebrate another birthday?" I'm sorry, how lucky are we to celebrate another year? Happy birthday. Now, for the most part, we don't hear a lot of positive things about aging, and we have to ask, why not? I mean, the truth is that people are living longer, healthier lives today, and that's a triumph. I mean, don't we say that getting older beats the alternative? It definitely does. But what we hear is that it's all about decline, nothing about personal development and deepening experiences and a renewed sense of purpose. Instead, with longevity on the rise and more people living longer, healthier lives, we hear, oh, how hard this is going to be on the healthcare system, what a burden it will be on Social Security, or how people who live longer are going to want to work past a certain age that's traditionally been called retirement age. I'm using air quotes here, and that'll disrupt the workplace. Now, the news just comes at us as if aging is a bad thing, when what we're really talking about is being alive. Aging is simply living. It's waking up another day, another month, another year, and we're still here. That's a good thing. So let's talk about what ageism is. Here's a definition of ageism: prejudice against oneself or others due to prejudice against others or ourselves due to chronological or perceived age. Now, in a little bit, we're going to talk about ways that ageism affects us, but first I'm going to tell you my story about how I was introduced to ageism, or when I really started to recognize it in my own life. I was on a job search in my 40s. I was applying for jobs that I was highly qualified for, and in the past, I was always used to getting called when I sent in a resume, because I was always a great match for the job and they wanted to meet me. But in my mid to late 40s, all of a sudden, I wasn't getting calls. And I started to realize all those things I've heard about employers ignoring applicants with a lot of experience, I'm seeing that it's true. Because for me, nothing had changed except my age. If anything, I had more experience and I was even more qualified. But looking for a job was suddenly an uphill battle. And when I did eventually get hired, I started handling communications for HR departments, and I started seeing how much focus was being placed on how to hire millennials. I think everybody's familiar with that term, right? People have created names for the different generations, and there's a whole slew of stereotypes that supposedly describe how people think and act according to what time frame we were born in. I'll talk about that a little bit later. I would hear about baby boomers, And according to my birth year, 1960, I'm supposed to be a baby boomer, but the way this group was being described didn't resonate with me. And I thought, where does this information come from? Now, it turns out that the data, and I'm making air quotes here again, the data behind these generation names has been debunked. It's faulty research that's really more of a marketing device, but the idea is really strong in the working world. And I'm planning to work for a long time. I don't need somebody applying age-related stereotypes to me to decide ahead of time what I do and don't know and what I'm like. So I made a strategic decision. I'm going to be involved in the fight against ageism. But it's not just about me. Researching and educating about ageism is not just for my own interest, because the more I started looking into it and learning more about it, the more I discovered how unhealthy it is for everybody. Ageism tells people in their 40s that they don't have anything to offer professionally. It tells people who need reading glasses that they should be embarrassed about how they look. Ageism tells people in their 80s that they should probably ignore medical issues because that pain is probably just normal. And ageism even tells children and young adults that their futures are going to be dismal, that they can expect to be sad and lonely and out of shape, and the world won't have any use for them anymore. And guess what happens when those are the expectations we've been given? We'll talk about that later too. But for now, let's try a little exercise. Let's look at ourselves. Remember, ageism is prejudice against others or ourselves due to chronological or perceived age. So here's the exercise. When's the last time you said you were too old for something? Or maybe you just thought it. Or maybe you thought that something was too old for you. Now take a couple of minutes to think about this. Was it an activity? Was it a certain technology? Was it some type of style or fashion? Think about that for a minute and maybe even jot down some notes, and I'll tell you a little story. Now, I was speaking to a group of people who live in a retirement community, and I asked this question, and one of the participants, a woman named Jan, said she had recently heard herself saying, "I'm too old to go hiking." So let's take a look at that one. Now, the next step in this exercise is to dig in and understand what we really mean when we say we're too old. Because nobody's too old for hiking, right? Age doesn't define who can go for a hike and who can't. There's no sign on the trail giving age limits. There are 100-year-olds who like to hike, and there are 20-year-olds who don't hike. So what does Jan mean when she says, "I'm too old to go hiking"? Well, we dug into it. And what she realized was that she doesn't currently trust her balance and her footing enough to walk on an uneven trail. Now that's completely different. Because if you don't trust your balance and your footing, but you want to go for a hike, there's something you can do. There are actions you can take. You can try some exercises to improve your balance and your strength. You can talk to a physical therapist. You can look into hiking poles. If you want to do something, then knowing what's actually holding you back is the key to knowing how to move forward. But if you blame it on age, there's nothing you can do about that. And it really just becomes an excuse. No matter what Jan does, she's never going to be any less old. No matter what I do, I'm never going to be any less 62 than I am. And that's true for all of us. But that's fine, because being old is not actually the problem. Now, here's another example. My son is 36, and he recently got a new job, and before he started, he decided to get a new haircut, make a good impression. So he showed me a picture of the last haircut he had, and he said, "Well, this was pretty good, but it was too old for me." Well, he knows me. So, of course, I said, "You know what I'm going to ask you. What do you really mean when you say a haircut is too old?" And he thought about it, and he said it was a little too sophisticated for what he wants, and he wanted something a little more fun. So there we go. Now we can go to the hairstylist and say, "I want it kind of like this picture, but that's too sophisticated. I want it to be a little more fun." And they can work with that. But it doesn't really mean anything if you say you don't want your haircut to look old. Does that mean You want the same haircut you had in 3rd grade? Probably not. So now he had something to work with. Plus, I got a chance to remind him that fun is not the opposite of old. We are never too old to have fun. And we're never too old to have a fun haircut. I don't know if you've seen Jamie Lee Curtis, but she rocks it. And she talks about the beautiful gift of aging. I also saw that she talks about being an opsimath, a late in life learner. Now that's a term that's new to me, but I love it. So now let's think about what came to mind for you the last time you said you were too old for something, or something was too old for you. What did you think of, and what did you really mean? I'd love to hear about what you were thinking and what you found during the Q&A session at the end, so we'll be sure to hold time for that. Now, we've looked into the definition of ageism and how we all sometimes turn it against ourselves. We're doing it, and our clients are doing it too. So now let's talk about why it matters. Why does ageism matter? Well, for one thing, we just thought through some of the things that we tell ourselves. We recognize that thinking our age is a problem can keep us from solving what's actually holding us back. And the problems go deeper than that. Research shows that the difference between thinking negatively about aging versus thinking positively about it can mean 7.5 years added to our lives. I've got a complicated graph here on the screen that summarizes some research out of Yale University, but the important thing to notice is that big yellow font that says 7.5 years. People who have a positive view of our own aging, when we think of it as growth and development and experience and exploration, we live on average 7.5 years longer than people who have a negative view of aging. Now, that's more of a longevity bonus than lowering our cholesterol or lowering our blood pressure, each of which adds about 4 years. This study came out in 2002, and if you haven't yet read Dr. Becca Levy's book called Breaking the Age Code, I can't recommend it highly enough, and I'll include this reference in the resources. Becca Levy was the primary researcher behind this research, and I'm not going to go into the details, but the headline here is, we live longer when we have a positive attitude about aging. So when we ask, why does ageism matter? There's another great reason: 7.5 years of life that can be taken away from us by the effects of ageism. And there are more reasons why ageism matters. Besides getting in the way of understanding the real problem and how long we live, ageism gets in the way of how fast we heal, how fast we learn. And research shows it can even affect things like hearing loss and cardiovascular disease. Our beliefs about our own aging can even affect memory loss and the possibility of developing dementia. Now, at least part of this is because having a positive approach to aging changes our behavior. Just like we talked about earlier, it's the difference between I'm too old to go hiking and I'm not giving up. Let's see what changes I can make to feel confident on the trail. And it's definitely relevant to clients and learners, right? It's the difference between I'm too old to learn something new and, oh, here's a class I can take on office technology. Now, our attitudes about aging aren't carved in stone. And our clients' attitudes about aging aren't carved in stone. No one is born thinking young is good and old is bad. It's something that we're taught through the culture we live in, which means it's something that can be untaught. But before we get into unteaching these patterns that we've learned, let's look at the next question. Where does it come from? Where does ageism come from, and how does it get into our heads? Well, ageist ideas come at us from an early age. We see them in children's books and the shows and movies we watch, even as little kids. There are wicked witches who are old and hunched over, and that's a common theme we see in literature, that being old means being evil or somehow unpleasant. There's a bedridden grandmother in Little Red Riding Hood, and she's very sweet, but that's another common theme, being needy and frail. And there are characters who we're just supposed to laugh at because they're out of touch and they say silly things just because they're older than everyone else. This happens on TV all the time. If you're familiar with Seinfeld, you might remember George Costanza's parents. They filled that role of just being silly and clueless just because they're old. The message from a young age is that being older is frightening and helpless and something to be laughed at. Then we hear the grown-ups in our lives saying unhappy things about their own aging too, which is often a mix of ageism and ableism. We hear adults saying they would never admit how old they are, or when they talk about something from the past, like music that was on the radio when they were teenagers, they say things like, well, I don't want to date myself, but, and we learn that we're supposed to be embarrassed if we were around a long time ago. And we hear people making jokes when they have to pull out reading glasses to see the menu, and there might even be a big laugh around the table. And then we see it in media and advertising. All the ads for anti-aging products, which suggests that nobody would ever want to look their age, right, unless they're 24, and that any visible signs of being a grown-up definitely need to be erased. We read about the aging of the workforce as a silver tsunami, more air quotes. You've probably heard this term. It suggests that no one saw this demographic change coming along, which is absolutely untrue, and that it's some terrible event that's going to leave devastation in its wake, when in fact, the average age of the population is rising because we're living longer, healthier lives. But good news doesn't sell magazines, right? So the media talks about longevity as a looming crisis, and old people get blamed for the job market and the cost of housing and all sorts of things. Even the medical community is part of the problem. Now, here's one example. There was a recent set of stories in the news saying that people should be regularly screened for anxiety, but not if we're over 65, because according to the medical community, anxiety is considered a normal part of aging, but it's not. Anxiety should be looked into and dealt with at any age and never ignored. We get a lot of ageism in the workplace. We hear that people want to hire younger employees, and all sorts of myths have been busted about older employees not staying for long, or what types of skills different people bring to the office. It turns out that a 50-year-old entrepreneur is twice as likely to achieve high growth as a founder in their 30s. But organizations generally believe the myth of the young entrepreneur, and they fall into the stereotype trap and think they're going to get more innovation and energy if they rally a young team around a project. And it just isn't true. And in spite of the drive in today's organizations toward diversity and equity and inclusion, we hear a lot about baby boomers this and millennials that, and generation this and that, which is completely based on stereotypes according to age, something that we would never do with any other group. Now, there are many research studies that point out the errors in these generational models, and here's a quote from one of them. Today's popular view of the generations has little basis in science. Instead, it arises from stereotyping, overgeneralizing from isolated examples, biased research methodology, and widespread prejudice. And yet these myths persist because consultants are making money off of them. Now, we talked about birthday cards earlier. They tend to be full of ageist and ableist jokes about memory and hearing and vision loss, and about older people being weak and silly and boring and over the hill, which is code for useless. These are the kinds of jokes that nobody would ever make about another group of people. I mean, nobody throws a birthday party for 2-year-olds saying, welcome to the potty accident years. And nobody buys a card for a 13-year-old that says, oh, good luck with the hormones and bad decisions. And if we did, stereotype activation tells us that there would actually be more potty accidents and more bad decisions. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what these stereotypes do to us, even when they're brought up casually. What is stereotype activation? Now, you might be aware of the studies that show when students sit down to take a test, if they're asked to fill out a form stating their race, then Black students perform worse on the test compared to Black students in the control group that aren't asked about race. Now, that's stereotype activation. There's a little part of the brain that's reminded, oh yeah, The message I've received my whole life is that Black students don't do as well, and then that subconsciously acts on the brain and it affects how people perform. Earlier, I mentioned Becca Levy, the Yale researcher. Some of her aging research focuses on the same process. She brings people into the lab and sits them in front of a computer to do some task, and while they're doing it, some of the test subjects are exposed to negative words like geezer and decrepit flashing across a screen, but it's subliminal. The words go across the computer screen so fast that they can't be consciously registered. Now, other test subjects are getting a different set of words that go by so fast they can't be read, words like wise and positive. And after the testing, subjects who were exposed to the negative words have shakier handwriting, and they literally walk more slowly as they leave the study. And this is true for people of all ages. Even 20-year-olds slow down when they're exposed to negative age-related words. That's stereotype activation, and it has a real and measurable impact on people. So now we're getting down to what ageism really does to us, because exposure to all these negative images and words in children's books, in movies, in advertisements, in headlines, and at work, it all adds up and fills our heads with the idea that older is a terrible thing to be. And over time, whenever there's a suggestion that we aren't capable, we literally behave less capably. When we're repeatedly told that we can't learn, it's harder to learn. When we register the word geezer, we literally slow down. Now, if Black students are performing worse on a test just as a result of confirming their race, what's happening to older adults when we hear a joke about older people in a cell phone? Or we're recruited into a study that's called Aging in Cognitive Decline. What are the chances that the study results are biased because the test subjects were exposed to stereotype activation right off the bat? I can get very worked up about this, as you can see, but I hope you're getting the idea that ageism isn't just a matter of being nice to old people. And it isn't just an issue of social justice. It's a matter of public health, too, because all these instances of ageism that we run into every day, they add up and they have real and sometimes lasting effects. You can think about it like secondhand smoke. Every time you see an ad for anti-aging products or a TV show where some older adult doesn't know how to use email, just imagine someone's blowing cigarette smoke right at you. I've got a picture on the screen here of a person smoking a cigarette and blowing the smoke. It's just an icon, don't worry. Nobody was harmed in the making of this picture. Every time that we hear that someone has let themselves go because their hair is gray and they're not getting Botox, every time we hear the word boomer or the phrase senior moment, people are blowing smoke in more ways than one. Now, years ago, when the dangers of secondhand smoke first came to light, there was a huge public health campaign to get the news out. But so far, we haven't seen that kind of campaign against ageism. But imagine yourself for just a moment. You're browsing through the birthday card aisle at the grocery store, and you pick up an interesting looking card to see what it says inside, and poof, suddenly there's a guy next to you smoking a cigarette, puffing out smoke. You read another card and there's another puff. It's like we need a warning label in the greeting card aisle. Consuming this product is hazardous to your health. And it happens when we do it to ourselves too. Every time we suggest the reason we forgot a name is because we're older, when in fact we forgot names when we were younger too. Every time we say we have an ache because we're old, when it's actually because of a sprain or a hard workout. Every time we do this, our minds and bodies are listening, and the effect is to slow us down, make us doubt ourselves, and make us less capable of doing what we want to do. Ashton Applewhite is the author of a book called This Chair Rocks, and she has a great TED Talk that I'm going to also include in the resources for this workshop. And I don't want to steal her thunder, but there's a really memorable moment in the video where she says, "I stopped blaming my sore knee on being 64. My other knee doesn't hurt, and it's just as old." Now, cells do change, of course, and we know that as time adds up, age is a risk factor in certain diseases. But in many ways, on a day-to-day basis, our beliefs about aging are bringing us down much more than age itself. Maybe George Bernard Shaw said it best. We don't stop playing because we grow old. We grow old because we stop playing. And the same is true of many things, like hiking and fun haircuts and learning. So you've been listening to me talk for a good while about what ageism is, where it comes from, and how it harms us. But I want to make one more point before we move on to finding solutions. Here I've got some icons of people of different ages. Ageism doesn't just harm older adults. Everybody's breathing the same smoke. Everybody's affected by these messages, from toddlers to big kids to college students to adults of all ages. I didn't challenge my son about not equating old with no fun because of how I want him to think about me. I challenged that idea because of how I want him to think about himself. I don't want my son to believe that getting older means he's going to stop having fun, because he's not. It's important to not let that kind of thinking get in the way at any stage of life, and all of us can be part of the solution. So let's turn our attention to solutions. How can we help? You can see how important it is to stop allowing ageism to be our reality, and to help others understand that this doesn't have to be their reality either. So how can we help? How can we stop making the problem worse and start making the situation better, especially for clients? Because we know it's one thing to stop ourselves when we notice unhealthy thoughts coming through, but ageism is so entrenched in our culture that people don't even realize what they're saying. They don't recognize that joking about having a senior moment, or even saying that someone looks great for their age, is actually contributing to a really big problem. And most of us don't want to come across like the word police, like, no, 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 you can't say that, it's ageist. We usually want to find a comfortable, helpful way to bring things up, because what we're really trying to do is help our clients, help ourselves, help everybody around us, and pay it forward to the next interaction that that person has. And the last thing we want to do is shut things down. So first, it helps to think about what we're up against. And we talked about how pervasive ageism is in our society. Now let's look at what ageism is like inside our brains. I'm showing a couple of definitions on the screen, and I'll get to them in just a minute. You're probably familiar with the ideas of explicit bias and implicit bias, especially if you've done any training on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, by the way, should be including age in the discussion, but it usually isn't. Now, here are a couple of definitions. Explicit bias is conscious preference, attitudes, beliefs, and stereotypes that influence judgment, decision-making, and behavior. Implicit bias, on the other hand, is attitudes, beliefs, and stereotypes that influence judgment, decision-making, and behavior in ways that are outside of conscious awareness and/or control. Let's look at the difference. Explicit bias would say, we need more younger people on the team because they're more innovative. Or did you ever hear Mark Zuckerberg's famous quote, "Younger people are just smarter"? Now, he said that in 2007, and just like the rest of us, he's 16 years older now. So I'd really love to know whether he thinks he was 16 years smarter back then, or hopefully he's changed his mind. But I digress. Let's get back to the definitions. So an opinion that's stated out loud like that, that's explicit bias. But implicit bias is unconscious. And it sounds more like, oh, I think some of our newer college graduates will be really interested in this project, but I don't think our more seasoned workers are looking for that kind of challenge. So ageism can come from either place, explicit or implicit bias. And when we apply this to clients might consciously believe that older people, including themselves, have less ability to learn, or they might just unconsciously decide, oh, that class just doesn't really sound like something for me. Either way, we would love to be able to step in and help. And either way, it can be hard to know how to respond. So let's look at a few techniques. These are some techniques that I've collected from other people in the pro-aging field and a couple that I've come up with myself. So let's take a look at them and see how they work. The first one is respond in kind. Respond the same way. Now, this one came from a colleague of mine, and it's kind of focused on comments from people who are younger. Because when someone says, "You look great for your age," and they're at an age where they don't think the word age applies to them, you can say, "You look great for your age too." And it kind of makes people stop and think. I know a man who says he gets asked all the time at work, "When are you going to retire?" And of course, the underlying message there is, I don't think it's normal for people your age to have a job. And if we really want to get picky about it, it kind of means, I don't think it's normal for people your age to be useful. But he's not planning to retire. It's not on his radar. So when people say, "When are you going to retire?" he says, "I don't know. When are you going to retire?" And it's especially fun when they are 30 years old. This one works really well for an ageist compliment, and especially, like I said, when it comes from somebody younger who automatically has an idea that older people normally don't have anything good going on in their lives. Now, the next one is answer with pride. And once again, this is usually more useful for some situations than it is for others. This is one that's great for ageist compliments too, like, "I can't believe you're 70. You don't look a day over 50. Answering with pride might look like, "Surprise, 70 looks this good." Or if you don't want to keep the focus on looks, which is, after all, the most superficial thing about us, answering with pride might look like, "Well, I don't need to be any younger than I am. 70 is wonderful." Here's another response to an ageist comment. You can ask, "What do you mean?" If someone says, "Aren't you thinking about retiring soon?" I've already made some assumptions about what they mean by that question, but it's also smart to live by the tenet, assume positive intent, right? And just ask someone, "What do you mean?" That can start a whole conversation about why someone might ask you about retirement. And this one's good for the "I'm too old" statements too. Find out why someone is saying, "I'm too old to take up a new hobby," or "I'm too old for social media." It starts a conversation. And that's the next idea. Start a conversation. "Tell me why you say that." Or, "Have I ever told you about my sister? She didn't take up horseback riding until she was 68. Anything that breaks through the fog of stereotype and assumptions and turns things around. So you're talking about growth opportunities and continued development. You're talking about living and learning and moving forward. Now, here's a response that I like to use. "We don't have to believe what the media tell us." This one works in a lot of situations. I was walking in the mall once, and I was behind a woman whose outfit I absolutely loved. She had on these fantastic leather pants and this dark green jacket that had pleats in the back, and it was made beautifully, and I just really loved her style. And I noticed that she had gray hair, and I thought, she's one of my people. And I had just read an article where someone had mentioned, it's so rare to get a compliment when we're older. It can be like we've become invisible. And so I thought, I'm going to give her a compliment. And as I caught up to her, because I am a fast walker, I looked over and I said, "Your outfit is incredible." And her immediate response was, "Well, you know," excuse me, I've been talking a lot. Her immediate response was, "Well, you know, when we get older, we have to try harder." And I thought, she felt like she had to hedge her response and not really soak up the compliment because of her age. But I was ready. And I said, "Oh, we don't have to believe what the media tell us. That's just a great outfit, period." And she looked happy. Maybe she thought about it. Maybe she'll even use that line on a friend and spread the idea a little further. And here's one more response that works really well, and it can open up some conversations. "Actually, I heard some interesting research." When someone says, "I'm old enough to remember going to the record store," and they act a little embarrassed about that, or they say, "Oh, I shouldn't date myself," just pipe up. "Actually, I heard some interesting research. It turns out that people who feel positive about their own aging live 7.5 years longer. I'm never going to be embarrassed about my age again. And you don't even have to have specific research at hand. Just use that phrase and follow up with anything that has to do with a healthy approach to aging. It turns out that feeling positive about our own nostalgic moments is really healthy. That's true. It turns out that gray hair is the new confidence move. It turns out that you can learn a new language at any age. I really like this one because I like research and I do a lot of reading about aging, so I feel like I can almost always make it fit. But here's the real key. Find out what's comfortable for you and practice a little. Practice it a little. So think about the kind of comments you hear most often and what you might say in response. And while you're thinking about that, let me share one more with you. I read this one on Facebook and I love it. It's not about responding to others as much as it is about stopping ourselves. The suggestion is, anytime you find that you're about to say, I'm having a senior moment, use this phrase instead. I can't remember the word in English right now. Isn't that great? You're not forgetting something. You're just too well educated and cosmopolitan to keep track of everything. And before we leave the topic of senior moment, I had to share this take on the phrase. A nonprofit called Help Age International started a campaign called #MySeniorMoment last October for the United Nations International Day of Older Persons. Now, the idea is for older adults to put a photo of themselves on social media doing something positive and fun, and to use that hashtag, #MySeniorMoment, to help turn that phrase around. Here I've got a photo from a woman who gave me permission to use it. She's in a bright pink t-shirt and bright pink shoes with black leggings, and she's wearing blue latex gloves and holding a can of spray paint. She's smiling at the camera, a little bit naughty, but she's also painting on a wall that's covered with bright graffiti. And I promise she's not breaking any laws. This is from an art museum she visited in Miami, where you can actually participate. She's obviously having a great time, and I think this is what a senior moment is all about. Now, here's another picture of a woman on the screen. This is Queen Elizabeth wearing bright yellow. Now, Queen Elizabeth was actually working until 2 days before she died at the age of 96. The reason I have her photo here, along with the word elder speak, is to bring up one more topic around ageism. And that is the way people sometimes speak to older adults as if they're children. Sweetie, would you like some help? Let's see if we can get this sweater all buttoned up. Now, my guess is nobody ever spoke like that to Queen Elizabeth, because everyone chose to treat her with dignity. And we all deserve that kind of dignity. In fact, here's an opportunity where you can pull out, actually, I heard some interesting research, because studies do show that when caretakers speak to older patients in a high-pitched voice and a childish cadence, the older patients actually respond by being more dependent. When we're spoken to like children, we're less likely to do things for ourselves and make decisions for ourselves. So it isn't just ridiculous and undignified. Speaking in a way that suggests someone is simple and incompetent actually encourages those behaviors. Once again, ageism actively causes harm. Now, my suspicion is that everyone here already knows that, and you all know better than to talk to clients like that. But if you ever need to let someone know how important this is, you can pull out the interesting research card, and you can remind people, just treat older clients with dignity. We all want that. So I'd like to wrap things up so we still have some time for live discussion. And before I do, let me share just a few resources with you. I mentioned Becca Levy, who's a gerontologist, a psychologist, and a researcher at Yale University, and she's the author of Breaking the Age Code: How Your Beliefs About Aging Determine How Long and Well You Live. I have a picture here of Becca and the front of her book. Absolutely recommend this book. Tracy Gendron is another important researcher in the field. She's the author of Ageism Unmasked: Exploring Age Bias and How to End It. Now, Tracy and I both serve on the Advisory Council for Ageism and Culture with the American Society on Aging, and I absolutely recommend her book too. You've got some reading to do. One more, I mentioned Ashton Applewhite, who's the author of This Chair Rocks, a manifesto against ageism. Ashton also has this great TED Talk called Let's End Ageism, and she's one of the leaders behind an online clearinghouse for information about ageism called oldschool.info. You can find a lot of resources there. In fact, I owe a debt of gratitude to Old School, which helped me get a project off the ground. Let me get back to my yard sign. Here's my project. I created a yard sign, and it's on the screen here. It has a deep green background and a lot of bold white words. It says, aging is living. There's no such thing as too experienced. Every age is the right age. Retirement is not a requirement. Longevity is the best thing to happen in ages. And age is not the problem. Ageism is the problem. Now, Old School helped me get this project off the ground so I can give away signs to raise awareness, and I've given away the artwork too, so that anyone can make their own signs or postcards or anything they like. I just really want to thank you for having me here today. I hope you've learned some new things and that you've got some new ideas on how we can all help people learn and develop, and as they say at Old School, make the world a better place in which to grow old. Thank you.